actually starting on time tonight. My name is Heather Roberge. I have the pleasure of introducing Monica Ponce de Leon. Monica is a leading figure in the pursuit of an experimental form of architectural practice, one that's motivated by applied academic research. She is the design director of Monica Ponce de Leon Studio and former founding partner of Alpha Staff. She holds the position of Dean of the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Planning. Monica is recognized as a pioneer in the application of robotic technology to building fabrication and construction. As director of Harvard's Digital Lab, she was among the first researchers to explore digital technologies for their capacity to produce innovative construction assemblies. Her work across all scales is most remarkable for its clever material investigations and the subsequent redefinition of the surfaces these materials define. When I consider her work, I'm drawn to the ever-present novel application of familiar materials. These materials are distributed in unexpected, yet highly plausible, even reasonable ways. She incorporates local construction methods, but pushes these methods to unanticipated limit conditions. I'm often left feeling surprised and even a little bit ashamed that the rest of us didn't imagine what she imagined first. Whether it be the first project I encountered as a sophomore in undergraduate school, the Casa La Roca in Caracas, Venezuela, which explores the material, tectonic, and perceptual qualities of a skin of terracotta with its parametrically distributed terracotta units, and this is from 1991, or the Helios House, which uses corrugated steel to render its building envelope as an architecturally scaled drape that's rendered both taut and loosened by programmatic and spatial conditions that fall outside of the existing building envelope. Or there's the New England house, which western wall is clad in a rubber membrane, typically used as a weather barrier only, which introduces a pliability and suppleness to the building envelope. In short, her work has always been ahead of its time. For this, she has been recognized with numerous awards, including the National Design Award in Architecture from the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the AIA Institute Honor Award. So it's with great respect, admiration, and quite a lot of humility that I introduce Monica Ponce de Leon.
Thank you, Heather. That's about the most beautiful introduction anyone has ever made. So thank you very much. And thank you, Hitoshi, for inviting me. And I apologize because I was supposed to come in the spring, and I actually was really sick. I got food poisoning the day I was supposed to get on the plane. So I appreciate everybody's patience. I actually have struggled to put together this lecture, in part because as dean, I get to see many great lectures, and in part because practice seems to be at an all-time low. On the one hand, I think there is a dramatic lack of interest in architecture as a form of cultural production, and I mean outside of the discipline. And then within the discipline, it seems that contemporary discourse continues to be dominated by two seemingly opposing thoughts. On the one hand, there are those that believe that technology is the end of all. Sorry, I'm using the wrong expression, the wrong American expression. That technology is the end all of architecture. be sustainable systems, be digital fabrication, be the software du jour. At the other end of the spectrum, and again, always presented sort of in opposition to technology, social consciousness is offered to us as almost as an architectural moral compass, as if architecture had the power to fix everything that is wrong in the world. I call this architecture a superhero. And I don't mean to imply that architecture is powerless. I actually think that architecture innately has capacities that other disciplines don't have, and that we have the power to affect change in the world, physical change in the world. But this conundrum between the two, what I consider the two sort of prevalent contemporary discourses in academia, in my mind, has made practice not only intellectually sterile, but in some circles, practice is considered even evil, as if practice, by the way, was not difficult enough. So I have put together the lecture. I give this as a big background, but I don't have big solutions, so please forgive me. So I put the lecture together more as thinking aloud lecture. I have a lot of new work interspersed with recent projects. So I'm sort of going off the cuff, and I hope that this will generate some discussion. And as background, I also wanted to talk about recent contributions to the discipline that I think are helping to get us out of this conundrum. You know, as the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Michigan, I have the luck, I said before, to see great lectures. And this allows me, on the one hand, to figure out which architects I want to be in conversation with, and on the other hand, really get to open up my mind to new ways of thinking about the work in ways that I had not considered previously. In the last 2 years, in my mind, at Michigan, there were 3 significant lectures. One was a lecture by Max Goggin and Merrill Ellen, and they talk about the ugly fall. And in that lecture, what they did was that they opened up a new way of looking at aesthetics. Aesthetics for a long time in architecture have been neglected, again, to the evil category. And they somehow recuperated it for the rest of us to ponder and to explore and to research. And this has been very much present in my thinking. Then Michael Hayes came to Michigan, and he had a very interesting take on the boundary between architecture and natural phenomena. He historicized it, but he also posed it as one avenue to move forward that somehow will get us beyond this obsession with sustainability. And then Sylvia Levin with Kissing Architecture, really re-examining the relationship between art and architecture, but turning it upside down in his head. And then there has been folks like Francois Roche, Greg Lynn, Neil Denari, Taubman, and Scott Cohen, who are grappling with similar issues and actually doing much better than me in terms of how to get outside again of this conundrum. So, as Heather said, I have historically been, I would say, obsessed with the idea that one could take all kinds of materials, new and old, and reconsider them in ways that perhaps are new and open new ways of thinking about the materiality, the making of architecture. I've always been interested in this possibility, not just as a fetishization of craft, but more as a way of creating a very animate building, one that creates certain effects that are unexpected. And in the unexpected make you reconsider the physical world around you. And it's been funny throughout my career because it has not been uncommon for folks to ask me things like, does that wall really move? Or how did you get the brick wall to actually open and close? Which of course is not what the operations are about, but more about the effect of creating something that implies a different life other than its own. And I have done this through conventional practice with clients, but also very fortunate to do it through academia, installation projects at various scales, in collaborations with students, and bringing that knowledge back into practice. It has been said of our work that aggregation is the essence of how we conceive of construction. So one day I decided that I would explore the notion of the smooth surface. And I became obsessed with the control of the break of that smooth surface. So all of the different kinds of features that are normally housed in a ceiling, from supply air, return air, lighting, sprinkler heads, and even microphones, are actually contained within a 3.5-inch gap. And then that gap then aligns throughout the space as a way of producing an uninterrupted and undifferentiated ceilings that becomes then the column. Now, what was interesting for me about this experience is that at the end, I learned that everything is actually the result of assembly, and the difference is whether you work with the notion of expressing the tectonic unit or actually hiding it. But that there is no such a thing as smoothness or easy smoothness in architecture. Now, this is a research that has taken different forms and that has led to a variety of projects, some more successful than others, but always with the intention that what you learn from one practice then is carried to the next. Another strand within the work has been this preoccupation with the colonnade, the loggia, the columnar system, and the reference between it and a system outside of itself, the reference to effects that may be found outside of architecture. This is in Los Angeles, so many of you are familiar with maybe familiar with the gas station. It was one of those situations where cladding became an excuse for changing the way that we thought of the columnar grid of the gas station, but also as a way of housing program within the column. So the column not only changes shapes depending on its location within the station itself, but also fattens up as a way of containing the area where you go and actually pay for your gas. So there was something for me fundamentally unsatisfactory about the gas station, and I always thought of it as a preamble to other projects because it was simply just a cladding job. There's no structural integrity to the cladding. And I became obsessed with what are the other functions that this system could be deployed for, and what other figures could it actually take. This is an image from the beginning of the movie Fargo, and I think it's the only way that I can describe this project. We were commissioned to build a land port of entry in Madawaska, Maine. So the idea of dealing with snow and the presence of snow became the main motivator for the project itself. The land port of entry, a small land port of entry, is basically a very long roof And you anticipate, and what we did is that we anticipated the collection of the snow, so we designed it so that it would purposefully change shapes as over time the snow would accumulate on it. It's a very low building. It's primarily 12 feet tall by regulation. It's on a slope, but it also had to contend with the 16-foot regulation for the canopies where the check-in of vehicles takes place. So the project simply takes the relationships between these different functions and tries to seamlessly reconcile them. And as a result, we end up with a canopy that is figuratively flexible, but literally flexible from a design point of view. So if the columns in Madawaska were intended to hold the weightiness of the snow, but did not reflect the weightiness of the snow, I think it's also interesting to think about the relationship between a column and the ceiling that it holds, and the kind of belly that is generated by that relationship. So when we were asked to take a look at a complex in Belgium called Queen Elizabeth Hall, right next to the zoo, we began to think of that bottom of the theater as an area that was rich for a different way of thinking about what it meant to hold weight. And of course, there is a long history of bottoms of theaters that are held by structural systems. And in our case, that relationship became an excuse to examine the notion of the belly in a more zoomorphic way. So as a result, the slope of the theater then became an alibi for the distortion of the canopies. And that thickness then for us became, again, not a reference to the classical colonnade, but a new way of thinking of that holding of the weight above. That kind of reference then became a way of thinking of the interior of the theater and to deal with the acoustics of the perimeter of the theater inside. So that something as simple as the manipulation of the texture of the walls of the theater then became, again, very rich ground for a different kind of, maybe perhaps more direct reference. So how the program affects the figure of the building, whether it's the figure inside the building or the figure outside the building, is something that I think can give us a tool for manipulating space. In this project, not only did we work with the belly of the theater and the volume of the theater, but something as simple as articulating the rehearsal spaces in the courtyard adjacent to the project. So more recently, I have been working with the difficulties of cultural reference in what I consider the arid landscape of suburbia. We were asked to move an existing library from the heart of a relatively homogeneous neighborhood to the boundary between three neighborhoods that constitute the city of Pompano Beach in Florida. Now, I normally hate telling war stories about projects, but I think this one gets to the bottom of architecture's cultural pertinence today. So I hope that you will allow me to indulge myself in this little story. We were asked not only to design a library, but also a cultural center above. And we were also asked to design the plaza in front of the library. And we were working as the project, which is this library here, Library and Cultural Center, was part of a larger master plan devised by Cohen and Partners. Cohen and Partners placed the parking behind the building, which makes sense, so that the plaza could actually face the street. But what became the main object of contention of the project is that the head of the Broward County Library System, one of our clients, required us to place the door in the back of the building. So I thought that the project would be controversial because of its image. I thought the project would be controversial because of its materiality. I never thought that I would be arguing for the location of a door in the front of a building. So, as a result, we ended up with really interesting discussions about what it meant for a building to give its back to the community. Again, I never thought in all my years that I would end up actually having this kind of conversation with a public entity and a public client. The other client, which is the city of Pompano Beach, which were the client for the cultural center, adamantly wanted the door on the plaza. The challenge was these two entities were never in the same room at the same time. So our strategy then was twofold. We decided to move away from the notion of a single entrance into two entries, one in the front and one in the back. With the intention that the front would be for the cultural center, the back would be for the library. But we moved the back to the middle, and we created what we call a breezeway in between them. As a result, the library actually crawls over a loggia, and in the same way that the cultural center crawls over a loggia of its own. And then the two buildings, in a way, intertwine. So while the buildings have separate entries and separate lives, which was logistically part of the program from the beginning, we were very interested in this notion of the two bodies that somehow interlock. And the language of one always relates to the other, so that there is a certain incestuous relationship between them. The building is constructed out of precast concrete panels that make a pedestal of sorts for panels of frosted glass, with the intent that the relationship between them would allow a manipulation of day and night. The upper level is where the black box theater is, and therefore is used only at night in the front of the building, whereas in the back, the upper level is the reading room for the adults, which is mostly used on weekends and later in the evening. So this duality of the lower level and the upper level was something that we were interested in reflecting through materials. Now, because the budget of the project is so low, the necessity of working with very flat surfaces and relying on the delineation of the surface as a way of articulating the form of the building was paramount. So we resorted to all techniques, like the scoring of stucco, or the highlight of a seam in the panel, in between the concrete panels, as a way of creating continuity from what we consider the upper part of the volume of the building, and its lower part. Unlike conventional colonnades that hold very heavy weight, this one holds a really light body. So as a result, the colonnade actually deflates in the moment that the column hits the belly, and then the belly sags where there is no column. For the development of the frosted glass skin, we were very much interested in the kind of optical illusion that is made by the thickening of lines. So our mullions actually project beyond the surface of the building, and because of the shifting in the angularity will give very different perceptual effects depending on what point of view the user has from the street. So this kind of zoomorphic research is actually rooted in a very careful examination and a very careful understanding of the optical effect of the thickening of a line. So this question of effect, I think, is one that is quite pertinent to architecture today. But it's one that cannot be relegated simply to material and cannot simply be relegated to surface. And that has to be understood both in relationship to program, but also in relationship to volume. And so one particular challenge or one particular question is, what do we do as architects when we are confronted with the really, I would say, challenged environment in the United States, where construction seems to fall under the category of surface making? And are we really limited to this notion of surface making? And of course, there are many that have argued that this is all we can do and that this is all we should do. So somehow when we were commissioned to do Atrium renovation for a hotel in Lower Manhattan, I decided to take a risk, even though we really needed the project. And I decided to not really do big moves on the surfaces of the atrium, and instead to work within a different kind of tradition of the monumental internalized space. This is an image from still from Metropolis. And what is interesting to me about it is that it really contains all of the different ingredients that have really been at the heart of how architecture has understood the atrium historically. You have the open elevator so that you can actually experience moving through space. You have trees throughout so that you can make evident that it's an internalization of nature and an internalization of the outdoors. And then, of course, there is the repetition of the balconies to give you scale. This is the Hyatt in Atlanta, and of course, America is really mastered the typology of the Atrium Hotel. And I have to say that I loved them. As a child growing up in the 70s, I just thought they were the most amazing, impressive things. And today, if you actually go to this hotel in particular, the green has grown more, and I couldn't find a good picture where the green where you can actually see the lusciousness of the interior. So, of course, I wouldn't be as lucky as to have one of the good ones. And instead, we were confronted with these Embassy Suites. Embassy Suites is really a suburban hotel, and they just happened to build one in Manhattan, and the characteristic of the materiality is very much suburban. We were charged really with a gut rehab, so we actually had the opportunity to change the balconies, and we did, and we had the opportunity to make dramatic changes. You can see here that. So the repetition of the balcony is as mundane as it can get. And the vertiginous quality of this 15-story atrium is as dramatic as it could get, except that it had been made mundane through its architectural strategies. One feature that is quite interesting, but that originally, I have to confess, I hated, is that there is a multiplex movie theater with a separate entrance that pushes into the volume of the atrium. And that push, that geometric twist, really became the catalyst for geometric manipulations that then allowed us to consider the interior. Now, the part of the project that was difficult to overcome, and I think is still difficult to overcome, is the presence of a very large solid drawing in the space. And during the job interview, I actually proposed that it should just be painted. The client very nicely said, I don't think we can do that. What we did do is that we eliminated the podium under the drawing, a podium that, funny enough, had plantings. And we opened it up so that now you can actually circulate underneath it. And in turn, we decided to place accordingly sized, large size pylons underneath the painting so that its weight now has a good visual relationship to the elevated ground. The project is located in an interesting junction right next to Scott Cohen's canopy in New York City, but part of a larger network of art pieces in this part of lower Manhattan. So that move of opening the bottom of the volume of the painting really opened up the space and increased its scale on the ground. So given the fact that we were stuck with the solid drawing, and by the way, I've come to love the solid drawing, it grows on you, it actually grows on you, then the strategy became how to cover it up. And because of the three-dimensionality of the drawing, because it peeks into the space, conventional veiling strategies, conventional theatrical strategies, we felt would not suffice. So we began to look at more complex theater arrangements and the kind of proscenium that are developed for theaters on the ground and more contemporary productions, where the beginning and the end of the frame, the beginning and the end of the proscenium, is somehow not as clear. And how to then veil the drawing, and in a way how to fill that space, and how to create that visual layering that would allow the space to be about something other or something more than a 12-story drawing sitting in two-story pylons. So we really wanted, this is a project by Scofidio, which I visited in Switzerland years ago before we began the project, but we really wanted to take advantage of the volume of the space, but at the same time fill it. So it felt somehow unsatisfactory to just simply put a plane and cut the height of the building. So instead we wanted to somehow occupy it with something that would then somehow metastasize the air in this space. So we devised then, rather than just one screen, multiple screens, we call them veils, and we decided that they should actually fill the entirety of the space. The geometry of that moment where the theaters come into the space, together with this unfortunate structure that actually holds the skin of the building, then became the catalyst for a series of geometries that very precisely then filled the air in the atrium. So the veils are quite simple. They're inverted pyramids, truncated at the bottom. And in the way that we truncated them, then it allowed us to play with different figures that then delineated space in different ways. This kind of preoccupation with suspension then took over other components of the project that took different architectural characteristics. For example, the stairs in the conference center. And then, of course, the interior designer, decorator had to hang these silly pipes here and go in the picture. We spent a lot of time with the precise delineation of that bottom cut and how it would affect the experience moving through space. And in particular, how it will then allow the lobby to be occupiable while still being part of their larger monumentality. We had similar struggles with what we call the upper frame, in that it had to transform as a means of allowing the basket that cleans the skylights to cut through it. But that gave us a way of actually referencing the drawing of the silhouette in a very physical and bodily way. And ultimately, for me, what is interesting is that while the silhouette, again, is part of a network of significant artworks throughout this area of Battery Park, the veil is, in a way, become yet another piece of art in the area. Questions. Thank you. This is the first time I show the hotel. We've struggled to photograph it. There's no way to photograph it. This is the first cut of the video, so you're looking at a raw, you're looking really at raw footage. But it's been interesting, there's been like 2 photos published. It's been interesting the reaction from friends that go see it in New York, and they're like, has nothing to do with photos. So that has not really happened to me before, this disjunction between photography and architecture. So that has been quite interesting.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way in which your practice informs the way you organize and think about curricula in your programs, and do you organize a school differently after having practiced for a while?
That's a good question. The school is really large. It's 440 students, so there's 220 in the undergrad and 220 in the grad. I think, and actually I have one of my board members here, advisory board members here, who lives in LA. So you can correct me if I say the wrong thing. But I think ultimately we all believe that school is school and practice is practice, and that what we want is to give students the tools to learn to think and to think critically. I had a very interesting moment actually with the board where we were discussing what are the right softwares the students should learn and which one is like the latest thing. And a board member, I think it was you, said, it's not important. Students, if they learn to think critically, they'll pick up the software in a week or so. So that's not really what school should be about. I have always been, I have always argued that the studio model, as antiquated as it is, continues to be what makes architecture so fundamentally nimble as a discipline. And what has been really rewarding as Dean is to see how many other disciplines are trying to now model themselves after the studio system. So we've tried different techniques that will make the studio broader, moving it away from the notion of the master architect that teaches the master class into an idea of not only collaboration among students, which is an old notion, but an idea of actually working with different disciplines simultaneously, and not necessarily the conventional disciplines that pertain to architecture, not engineering, although we do that too, but also the more unexpected ones, to bring into the studio different modes of thinking that until now have not necessarily been part of the way the studio thinks. I think there was a period where criticism served that role, and in my mind it should still serve that role. But because architecture again is so nimble, I think we have an opportunity to bring other strategies to the table. So that doesn't necessarily answer the question directly, but.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I actually want to also appreciate your opening comment on framing sort of this dichotomy or the spectrum of opinions on architecture education right now. In particular, how you mentioned the technology versus sort of the super the superhero mentality of architects. I'm wondering if how you view sort of the resolution to that, if we can even predict such a thing, and maybe to bring up a topic that has been spoken about earlier this year, but the Caracas Golden Lion for the Torre David.
You know that I'm from Venezuela, right?
I do. So I mean, for all the more, I'm curious about.
I actually wrote about this. This is something I feel really strongly about. The arrogance of a discipline that would permeate a project that appropriates the living conditions of those who have no other choice, and that actually exalts it as if they are empowered, for me was extremely offensive. And the reason it was particularly offensive is perhaps because I was educated at a time where the work of people like Martha Rosler or Barbara Kruger, these are artists, if you don't know their work, you should know it, was very much influenced in architecture. And the work from this strand of art practitioners really put on the table the notion that creative practice should be independent of pretending that you can actually help those of lesser means, much less appropriate the conditions of those who have lesser means as a way of advancing your own professional career. So, for example, Martha Rosler has a whole did a whole series of photographs on the homeless. And what she did is that instead of photographing, this might seem simple, but actually at the time was eye-opening. She did a series of photographs of spaces that had been occupied by the homeless, but not with the homeless in them, right? So what it did is that it called attention to the space, but made a stance towards the notion of appropriating as subjects somebody who you are actually very distant from. Barbara Kruger was more extreme. She actually photographed herself, right, as opposed to using others for her photos. So she would disguise herself. She was the first one to do this. She would disguise herself in different attire, which was really powerful. So for me, the Caracas think tank project is offensive in that it negates this history and a very powerful history. And to me, it sort of spits on the face of those who are actually living in the towers. I don't know if you guys know this project. It's not really a project. It's an installation it was an installation in the Venice Biennale last year, and it won the Golden Lion. And what they did is that they replicated a cantina. A cantina is just simply a popular, I don't know what you call it, food stand, there we go. A popular food stand from the tower. It gets transplanted to the Venice Biennale. When you think about the fact that it's enjoyed by tourists as a tourist attraction, and a very rarefied version of a tourist, right? Architectural tourism can't even be more rarefied than that. It's known as, there's no positive outcome that can come from that kind of appropriation. So, I mean, at the end of the day, one of the challenges with this notion of architect as superhero is that it feeds into the do-it-yourself mentality of cultural production, it feeds into the do-it-yourself mentality of solving societal problems that in my mind should be the job of society at large. And by us contributing to quote-unquote solve the problem, what we're doing is that we're covering the fact that the social network that used to help us get through life is now gone. So, and the tower is a case in point. It's a tower that was never completed. There is no money for housing in Caracas, so the poor have nowhere to go, so they take over the tower, right? So the project celebrated this taking over a symbol of capitalism, but it hides the fact that, well, all of the safety nets that the government used to provide are now gone, and that's why these folks have to go into the tower. So, and, you know, these are difficult topics because it, you know, we all want to be good people, obviously, right? And we all want to do the right thing. And it doesn't mean that as architects we have to not do the right thing. I was happy arguing for the location of the door, you know, in my library and cultural center. And I argue for it, not just because architecturally it would be ridiculous to have a door in the back of a building, but because it would be giving its back to the African American community that comes by bus and that will be crossing the plaza and will be favoring the Caucasian community that drives to the library, right? So, you know, architecture is always full of politics, but these are small battles. And the dilemma is that if we think that politics is the reason for architectural production, then it covers up the fact that they're small battles. And it makes them seem as if they are the large battles. I hope that makes some sense. Other questions?
Yeah, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to the colonnade and to the columns and kind of where it began for you.
I have, to me, two aspects of articulating material systems in buildings are tied to, on the one hand, structure, and on the other hand, program. So inevitably, these two tendencies within the work have led to a certain structural logics or e-logics that articulate components of all of our projects. And a program, on the other hand, has led to relationships between the skins and the volumes that they house. And sometimes these relationships are comfortable, sometimes they're uncomfortable. And at the root of both has been a desire to evoke multiple imageries that may seem inappropriate to architecture. I showed a little clip of a project that I didn't go into a lot of detail, where the columns delaminated into multiple vector systems. It's an exaggerated structural system that did not need be, right? And architecture is always about excess. In that case, we were thinking of the branches of the trees around the building. It sounds so reductive when you actually say it, and this is why I struggle with the work. Because once you put words into it, it's somehow, oh, really, the building is tree, right? So, but that's one vein of the work. And in parallel, the opposite exaggeration has also been true. The idea of wanting them to be fatter than they need to be, and almost buckling under the pressure of the building above. And both trends, of course, have long histories in architecture, and the fun has been to have to contribute to those long histories. Anybody else?
Monica, thank you for appreciate it. I have a question about this project. You introduced this project with what I thought was an oblique and very subtle reference to, in other words, those who would say that the cladding of the building or the exterior is the last bastion of design.
Or the surface of the atrium.
Right. Well, I'm wondering, and this clearly is a deeply interior project, and I think it's muscular in terms of its dealings with the interior. I wonder if you'd be would you be willing to be, say, more explicit about, in terms of a counter argument to that?
It's funny that you think it's muscular.
Well, I don't mean it looks muscular. I mean in terms of the energy expended.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's where it is. So,
you know, they started with a mini competition, And it started with a huge argument in the office, where there was a desire to just simply do what most likely everybody was doing, which was just the balconies, just resurface them, maybe change the shape, and so on. And I thought that that was not enough, that we needed to devise a new way of thinking of architecture that would actually fill the air. And Dieter Scofidio's project was very much present in the office, but of course that's a temporary installation in an expo that very few went to see. It has tremendous implications in the imaginary of the discipline. But I wanted to see if we could actually take a stab at not working with the delineation of the boundary between monumental space and small space of balcony, and instead take a stab at the whole. So it is excessive. You know, we could take it away tomorrow. There's no real program to it. There's lights on the bottom, but that the client wanted the lights. I'm not necessarily excited about the lights. I'm not going to pretend that that's why we did it. You can have lights coming from the floor. But it was more of a desire to have architecture invade the monumentality of the volume and change its atmospheric quality. So at points, I thought of it as rain, frozen rain, as opposed to cables, but more frozen rain. And at points, I've thought of it as a cloud that diffuses the way that you see through it. And it's interesting, the tension between the cables and the optic of looking through it and the way that the light hits it really plays between those two extremes. And that was very intentional. So, does that answer the question? Somehow I think you wanted something more.
I mean, I guess it does go a long way to answering the question, actually. But I guess I was wondering if you're willing to explicitly state that those who would say that that all that architecture is left with is the surface are wrong.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
wrong.
just
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that that's what you.
No, I
Here I am struggling to describe the project. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Again, we have historically, because of the obsession with the material that makes building, my work has been associated with surfaces. But for me, surfaces have always been in the function of volume. So so this one for me was an opportunity to fill the space with multiple surfaces so that it will no longer be a liner. So that's it.
Hi, I just only wondered if you ever had an opportunity to collaborate with the content of the space, like when you mentioned theater or community centers, to influence in a way the community's use of the space.
This space is not intended to be programmed. Hilton will not go for that. But what it is interesting is that, and it was impossible to represent, we work with a lighting designer so that at night the lighting actually changes the color of the silhouette, and it changes it really progressively, which is really amazing. It's sort of tacky but amazing at the same time. So that's as far as we went with this notion of performance. And I have to say I love the experience of the elevator. I could ride up and down those elevators all day long, because it makes you be part of the theater as opposed to some other thing that you observe. And my favorite story about the hotel is that last time I checked in, the concierge told me that a little boy came in and asked, "Where is Spider-Man?"
Just if I want to ask one more question, when we got to the project before where the library and the theater or something
Cultural
like that,
center,
yeah, were divided. I mean, that is like where people come more continuously and have a more continuous exposure to whatever you decided and was implemented. I mean, did you have any view on how that impacted the community in a positive way?
The cultural center is a very unique cultural center in that it's media-based. The ground level, you know how I described how both the library and the cultural center start at the ground and they climb up on top of each other? The ground level of the cultural center is really a media lab to train people from the community on different kind of media. And we know that libraries do that as well. So the project actually plays the spaces of the library that do that in front of the spaces of the cultural center that do that, with the intent that folks will get their basics from the librarian, and if they get really good at it, if they become really interested, particularly teenagers, then they will go across the courtyard to the media lab for the cultural center. So one thing that goes back to your question about curriculum in a tangential way has to do with the relationship between projects such as this one and the act of teaching and the act of collaboration, and the relationship between practices and what it happens in schools and how we learn very much from it. So the best projects that I showed today, this one, it might not be one, sorry. And then the cafeteria, which I didn't even describe it as a cafeteria. This one. Were both led by UCLA graduates. And the kind of body of knowledge that they brought to the project, and the kind of vitality that they brought to the project, and the kind of critical thinking that they brought to the project is truly something that you will not really be able to get without that kind of intimate relationship between a project and those who are working on it. Ellie Abrams did this one, and Mira Henry, who's sitting in the back, did the other one. And she also worked on the library, actually, and cultural center. So I think that you cannot really engineer the relationship between practice and academia, and academia benefits from practice in some ways, but I think practice benefits more from academia. Other questions? Please.
As a motive to approaching form, and that when dealing with form, you look for the dealing of a material towards producing the unexpected. And I would like you to tell me, in your words, how do you think that the unexpected contributes to cultural production?
Very good question. At the end of the day, is what distinguishes, is what makes architecture an art, right? If architecture were to do what is expected of it, then you will be working with the bare minimum structural logics, the bare minimum practical requirements, pragmatic requirements, programmatic requirements. And architecture, at the end of the day, of course, is about excess. And excess is what makes architecture more of a fiction and less of a biography, let's say, right? So I think that's true not just of my work. I think it's true of architecture as a whole. We all, in a way, are searching for the new, we're all searching for the unexpected, because without it, there is really building, there is no architecture. I don't know if that makes sense. One more question? Or are we ready to go after this? Okay. Thank you.